No doubt you've discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm, as your father believes.
Then what is?
I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm.
Across the Spanish Main. Part 12. The Brethren of the Coast. A French cleric named Abbé Jean-Baptiste du Tertre, who went to the Spanish Main in the 1670s to minister to plantation slaves, encountered the buccaneers on his rounds. Of these buccaneers he wrote that, in general, they were without any habitation or fixed abode, but rendezvoused where the animals were to be found. These freebooters hunted game in groups of 6 or 8, setting out usually at dawn. Curiously, some groups specialized in pigs, and some went after cattle, but they hunted one species or the other, not both at the same time. They indulged in no breakfast until as many animals had been killed as there were men in the party. Then, as they skinned the beast and put the meat to smoke, they took time out for a meal of bone marrow. By evening, when the meat had been smoking for several hours, acquiring a deep red color and a zesty flavor, the buccaneers had a dinner of roast flesh. They stored the extra meat and hides in rude sheds of leaves, branches, and skins. If it rained, they might take shelter in a similar lean-to themselves. Otherwise, they lay down to sleep beside their buccan fires, whose smoke might drive off the mosquitoes. When the sails of a smuggler or privateer loomed on the horizon, the buccaneers took their products to harbor where the vessel put in, going out by canoe or pinnace to barter their meat and hides with the ship's crew. After a successful trade, an occasional dandy among them might strut about in crimson trousers and a purple serape, but most preferred the buccaneers' own distinctive and distinctively unkempt clothing. Du Tertre observed, "You would say that these are the butcher's vilest servants who have been 8 days in the slaughterhouse without washing themselves." The buccaneers usually wore rawhide breeches to shield themselves from thorns of the island's cacti, a coarse linen tunic-like shirt, pigskin boots, and a hat to keep off the tropical sun. The buccaneers were also conspicuous for the open-handedness with which they spent their profits. Their main vice, according to John Esquemeling, the chronicler and storyteller, was drunkenness, which Esquemeling reports that they exercise for the most part with brandy. This they drink as liberally as the Spaniards do clear fountain water. Sometimes they buy together a pipe of wine. This they stave at one end and never cease drinking until they have made an end of it. Thus they celebrate the festivals of Bacchus so long as they have any money left. Women were as scarce among the buccaneers as on shipboard, and in this all-male society each buccaneer had his partner. Partners traveled together, protected each other in combat, and shared bonds of companionship that were often as strong as those of a marriage. In the case of the death of one buccaneer, his partner inherited his belongings. But their baggage was scant. A pair of long butcher knives which a buccaneer wore thrust into his waistband, a double-edged sword secured to a baldric, a belt that ran diagonally across his chest, and, the most prized possession, a gun with a spade-shaped stock and 4-foot barrel. A good French matchlock musket smuggled in from Normandy might be worth around 20 hides, and almost without exception the buccaneers learned to be a crack shot. It took a keen eye and a sure hand to bring down a pig in the bush or a galloping cow without ruining the hide. When a band of buccaneers got tired of chasing cattle or simply felt the lure of the seas, they might send a messenger along the coast to let it be known that they were planning a raid. For days, buccaneers in groups of 6 or 8 would congregate at a specified rendezvous, bringing along their own guns, powder, and knives. They usually met jovially over a barrel of brandy and a meal of smoked meat and boiled yams, and decided by vote where to lie in wait for a passing Spanish merchantman. For men who led such an otherwise casual life, they had surprisingly rigid rules. The leader provided a scroll and drew up a written agreement to be signed or marked by all those present. Fixed sums of money were allocated in advance for special purposes. One such was a salary for the group's carpenter, whose role was vital in keeping the ship seaworthy and properly rigged. He might also serve as the surgeon if there was none else available. A schedule of compensation for wounds suffered in action was also drawn up. The loss of a right arm was generally worth 600 pieces of 8, An eye usually brought only 100 pieces of 8, so did a finger. A buccaneer could, after all, aim his musket with only one eye, but he needed both arms to fire. On the conclusion of a successful raid, all debts were to be paid first from the common prize before any division of the spoils was made. Then the remainder would be handed around before the mast. The captain was entitled to 5 shares, the mate to 2. 1 share each went to all the rest of the crew, save for the cabin boy, who only got a half share for performing potentially the most unenviable job of all. In the event that the vessel was abandoned, it fell to him to set it on fire and then be the last to leave. He had to be nimble to catch up with his comrades scrambling around another ship. Few 17th century cabin boys could swim. As he signed the Articles of Agreement, or made his mark, each man swore not to conceal from his mates. The usual punishment for any found guilty of stealing was marooning, a fate that even these island-wise men regarded with horror. The condemned man was put ashore on a small and isolated island with nothing but a flask of water and his weapons. Almost invariably, it was a sentence of death, a lonely, lingering one at that. In preying upon the Spaniards' shipping, the buccaneers typically used tactics like those employed by Pierre le Grand when he unburdened the treasure galleon of its cargo off Hispaniola. Probably half the vessels from which they mounted their bold attacks on the Spaniards' 200 and 300-ton galleons were no bigger than a 50-ton pinnace. Because the buccaneers used small craft and because they made it a practice to strike their sails as they approached the targets, the vessels were not visible but from a short distance away, and when they could be seen, they looked deceptively innocent. As the buccaneers' tiny pinnace came close to its prey, one of their superb marksmen, seated in the bow, would fire his musket first at the Spanish steersman and then at the men handling the sails, while the rest blasted the portholes to keep the curious from looking out. If there were several boats in the raiding party, one would wedge itself against the Spaniard's rudder. Then, with both ship and helmsman disabled, and the rest of the Spanish crew thrown into confusion, the buccaneers would swarm aboard, uttering ferocious yells and slashing with their cutlasses as they beat a path for the captain and the treasure. Crewmen of no account or standing were summarily beheaded or put adrift in a small boat. The captain and any officers able to pay a ransom were held until they did so. Counting ransoms, a successful raid could fetch even the lowliest among the buccaneers a prize that ranged from 700 to 1,000 pounds. As the buccaneers grew bolder and more numerous, they came to call themselves the Brethren of the Coast, a term that seems to have come into use sometime in the 1640s. The originator of the phrase is unknown, but the words reflect the unity with which the buccaneers saw themselves as allied against the common enemy, the Spaniards, irrespective of their own national origins. The term also acknowledged a certain change in their ways. The roaming, isolated bands began to coalesce into larger and larger groups. They established more or less permanent encampments, notably on the coast of Hispaniola and the south coast of Jamaica. And while they still hunted and did a lucrative business in hides, these hordes of brethren increasingly turned their energies to plundering the Spaniards wherever they were weak, at sea or on land. A favorite haunt for a large number of buccaneers was a hump-backed sliver of rock 25 miles long off the northwest coast of Hispaniola. Columbus, who discovered it on his first voyage, named it Tortuga, meaning turtle, for its resemblance to that aquatic creature. Tortuga was a buccaneer's dream. The island permitted planting on a small scale, it boasted an excellent harbor, it gave easy access to the hunting grounds on larger islands, it lay across from important Spanish shipping routes through the Windward Passage and along the coast of Cuba, and finally it was eminently defensible. There were only a few places on the island where an enemy could land any force. The north shore was consistently pounded by the Atlantic surf, and most of the south shore, except for the harbor, consisted of shallow bays and flats, covered with dense mangrove tangles. The first recorded occupation of Tortuga was in the 1630s, when an Englishman named Anthony Hilton sailed over from Hispaniola with a band of buccaneers and built a base camp for raiders coming and going through the Windward Passage. Hilton seems to have lasted as chief of Tortuga for only a few years before he was succeeded by a more ambitious and effective buccaneer. This new leader was Jean Levasseur, a Huguenot who had been driven from his homeland and had to seek his fortune in the New World. A military engineer by profession, Levasseur made Tortuga a proper stronghold. adding some man-made marvels of engineering to the blessing already bestowed by nature. On the island was a flat-topped mountain overlooking the harbor. The mountain itself was protected by almost impenetrable bush and crowned with a 30-foot outcropping of solid rock. On this rocky prominence, Levasseur carved the aptly named Fort de Rocher, the Rock Fort, and armed it with 24 cannon. From the harbor side, the fort could be reached only by ladders. Nearby was a natural spring that made it possible, by Esquemeling's account, for 700 or 800 men to hold out there indefinitely. For 12 years, while taking a percentage of all buccaneer loot that passed through the port, Levasseur reigned as a sort of buccaneer king, and a mean, greedy king he was. Not content with a share of the plunder, he also levied a special tax on the hides brought to Tortuga from Hispaniola. When a Spanish prize ship yielded up a silver Madonna, and the devoutly Catholic Frenchmen on St. Kitts sent word asking if they might have it for their church, Levasseur insultingly gave them a wood facsimile, saying that they were doubtless too spiritual to notice the difference. Finally, in 1652, he appropriated the mistress of one of his lieutenants, and that was going too far. One afternoon, as Levasseur went to inspect the port's warehouse, the lieutenant lay in wait and stabbed him to death. Levasseur was followed as Tortuga's chief by the Chevalier de Fontenay, another hard-case Frenchman who could be just as merciless towards his own men as Levasseur had been, as he proved when the Spaniards arrived in 1654 to assault the stronghold. The Spaniards sent 5 heavily armed ships and a number of smaller transports which fought their way into the harbor and landed a force of several hundred men. While some of the soldiers kept the buccaneers atop the cliff occupied, the Spaniards set a gang of slaves off to hacking a path through the bush and dragging cannon up the mountain at the rear of the fort. When a rain of cannonballs began to crash into the buccaneer stronghold from behind, one of Fontenay's lieutenants suggested they surrender. Fontenay quickly branded him a traitor and shot his lieutenant dead. Yet nothing could save the fort. The Spaniards managed to conquer it, for the only time in its history. Incredibly, they merely deported Fontenay back to France, and were content to let the rest of the buccaneers flee across the water to Hispaniola. Then the Spanish withdrew their troops, and back like the tide came the buccaneers, in greater strength than ever before. Tenacity was only one of the qualities that the buccaneers brought to their unceasing conflict with the Spaniards. They were as ferocious and opportunistic as wolves, and cruel to the point of barbarism. So hurtful were they to their victims that the Spaniards who did fall into their hands sometimes promised to comply with any buccaneer demands even before the buccaneers had a chance to say what they wanted. And to all this the buccaneers added an unfailing guile that befuddled their enemies time and again. Esquemeling's tales of their exploits are far-fetched, but they reflect the sense of fear and frustration the Spaniards were experiencing in the center of the New World Empire. Nothing delighted Esquemeling's storytelling heart more than to relate near-miraculous buccaneer escapes from Spanish clutches. According to the chronicler, a buccaneer named Bartholomew Portuguese, because of his birthplace, was surely one of the slickest rogues ever to dupe a Spaniard. Prowling the coast of Cuba with a mere 30 men in a vessel mounting only 4 small guns, Bartholomew came upon a great galleon en route from Cartagena to Havana. The Spanish vessel carried 20 heavy guns and a crew of 70 men, but the dauntless Bartholomew attacked nonetheless. After a long and dangerous fight, recounted Esquemeling, Bartholomew became master of the great vessel. He lost 10 men and had 4 wounded, but he inflicted double those losses on the adversaries, and found that he had won 70,000 pieces of 8, as well as 120,000 pounds of valuable cacao beans. Unable to return immediately to his lair on Jamaica because of contrary winds, Bartholomew headed for a secluded anchorage on Cuba's Cape San Antonio, intending to take on water while he waited for a favorable breeze. But just as he and his prize rounded the Cape, disaster overtook him. 3 Spanish galleons bound from Havana to Mexico suddenly bore down on the buccaneers. Esquemeling writes that they were easily retaken, both ships and pirates, and stripped of all the riches they had pillaged so little before. The galleons continued majestically on to Campeche, chief port of the Yucatan Peninsula, where the whole band of buccaneers was thrown into prison. All that is except Bartholomew himself, who was kept under close guard aboard ship while a special gallows was built to hang him from. But Bartholomew was not yet finished. During the night, when his jailer dropped off to sleep, Bartholomew eased the fellow's knife from his belt and stabbed him to death. Bartholomew was still trapped, for the ship was anchored far out in the roadstead, and he was no better able to swim than the average cabin boy. No matter. From the ship's stores, the crafty buccaneer seized 2 earthen wine jars. Whether he drank the contents or poured them overboard is not recorded. In any event, he corked the wine jars, strapped them one on either side of his torso, and behold, a life jacket. Without further ado, he slipped into the water and bobbed his way to shore in the dark of the night. He was well on his way to freedom by the time the Spaniards discovered his absence the following morning. All that day, search parties combed the countryside around Campeche, while the buccaneer gleefully watched from the safety of a hollow tree. When he saw that they had called off the search, he slipped away through the woods and 2 weeks later turned up at the Cape of Golfo Triste, some 120 miles from the scene of his capture. There, Bartholomew Portuguese found a buccaneer vessel filled with old comrades from Jamaica, and before very long, he who had been facing the gallows now had a second turn of fortune and became rich and powerful once again. In another tale woven by Esquemeling, the Spaniards were cheated of vengeance against a buccaneer by their own greed. The hero of this tale was a clever man named Pierre Francois, who was cruising off the Venezuelan coast in a pinnace with 26 companions when he spied a dozen ships of the sort that carried slaves to dive for pearls. Pulling down his sails, Pierre ordered his crew to row nonchalantly along the shore as though theirs was just another fishing vessel. Reaching the pearl bank, he and his men suddenly sprang upon the Spaniards' flagship and captured it, together with a fine cargo of pearls worth 100,000 pieces of 8. Alas, for Pierre, his seamanship was not equal to his guile. In trying to make his escape, he piled on too much sail and crashed down the mainmast. The remaining Spanish vessels overtook him. Finding himself trapped, Pierre called once again on his wits, and won from the Spaniards the buccaneers' lives in exchange for the loot, which presumably Pierre threatened to send to the bottom. The Spaniards accepted the pearls and, true to their promise, put the buccaneers ashore safe and sound. In the case of Roque Brasiliano, a Dutchman so named for the time he had spent in Brazil, terror was the lever that pried open the dungeon doors. Roque was known far and wide as a buccaneer of awful ferocity, who tortured and murdered his captives. He undoubtedly expected like treatment when he was seized with a boatload of freebooters off Campeche and thrown into prison. However, Roque devised the stratagem of writing a letter to the Spanish governor, purporting to be from fellow buccaneers lurking off the coast. The storyteller Esquemeling interestingly neglects to explain where, in a Mexican dungeon, Roque found a quill and scroll, or how he managed to gull the governor into thinking that the letter came from outside the prison. In any event, the letter advised the governor that he should now take care of those he had in prison, for in case he caused them any harm, the letter swore unto him that they would never give quarter to any person of the Spanish nation from that time on. Esquemeling goes on to say that the governor, undoubtedly shuddering at the vision of himself being smoked alongside meats on a buccaneer spit, truly became terrified and released Roque and his friends, pointlessly only asking that Roque and his men give up buccaneering. The buccaneers gladly gave their oath, and just as cheerfully went back on their word the moment they were loose. When seen again in Esquemeling's pages, Roque and his men are setting forth again to raid out of Jamaica. The tales of Esquemeling don't stop there, and neither do the exploits of this new band of brigands, these buccaneers, these brethren of the coast.